So today we're going to be going over Sony A3000 camera right here. Now this is a camera that when you first look at it, you might think that this is a DSLR camera, but it's actually a mirrorless camera that Sony made back in 2013, and as you can see, it has an APC sensor on it that has 20 megapixels, and today we're going to be going over this camera to see if you can still get professional looking images with this camera, so let's begin. So can you take professional photos using the A3000? Now when it comes to professional photography, there's two things that I look for in a camera, which is going to be, first of all, the interchangeable lens mount on a camera. If a camera doesn't have interchangeable lens mount, then you're going to be very limited by the lens you have. So having interchangeable lens mount is so important. The second thing is going to be a hot shoe mount on the camera. Now hot shoe mounts are super important to have on any camera that you want to use it professionally, because that's the way you're going to be able to connect professional lights onto the camera. You can either, if you're doing events or something, you can connect a flash directly on top of the camera, so when you press the shutter button, it'll flash the light and then you can bounce that light off of the wall or something and get a decent looking light. I'm not a huge fan of it, but if you're shooting weddings or if you're doing any events indoors, that's what you gotta do. But if you're working at a studio or something and you want to connect professional lights to the camera, then the best way to do it is to get a trigger for your camera, and then that way you can connect it to the hot shoe of the camera, and that way when you take a picture, it will trigger the flashes through the hot shoe mount. So that's super important to have on any camera that you want to use professionally. Since this camera uses Sony E-mount, you have so many options of lenses you can use. You can use the amazing Sony E-mount lenses made by Sony, and also there's so many options by third-party lens producers, so you can get yourself something like this, a 50mm 1.8 lens, and this is a full-frame lens. But on this body, it actually fits it like perfectly well. Look at this right here. It looks perfect on there and works great on the camera. But you're not just limited to the Sony lenses. You can also even adapt vintage lenses to the camera. Since it's a mirrorless camera system, you have so many options of lenses you can use. Like you can use a Helios vintage lens like this. And this is actually my favorite way of using this camera. We'll get into why that is later on in the video. I'm going to show you guys pictures I have taken with this vintage lens right here, and you can just put it on the camera and boom, now you have a vintage lens. You can manually focus and use it on the camera, but you're not even just limited to that. You can even adapt Canon lenses on this camera. So we got right here, this is a 150 to 600mm lens, and you can adapt this onto this tiny little camera, and there we go. Here, we can make this even bigger. We can just go boom, boom. We have 600mm lens on this camera. It's this Super 35 sensor on here. This actually becomes 900mm on this camera. And even though this is an older camera, you can still use autofocus with this Canon lens on this camera. But what about the image quality out of this camera? Now, when you're shooting at the base ISO of this camera, you can take some amazing looking images with this camera. Right here, we have a picture from a Sony A7R III, which is their Sony's, professional camera system that has 42 megapixels, and compared to this camera with 20 megapixels, as you can see right here, you can't even tell the difference. Now the A7R III image is cropped a little bit because one of the cameras is full frame, the other one's Super 35. So when you shoot with them, they have different focal lengths. So if we zoom out right here, you can see that the full frame sensor captures more of the image while the APC sensor crops in a little bit. But even so, between the 42 megapixels and the 20 megapixels, the camera will pretty much take the same exact images when you shoot at the base ISO. So is the Sony A3000 a perfect camera? And obviously it's not a perfect camera. There's a lot of problems with this camera, but there's a lot of good things about it too. But there's two main issues with this camera right here. Like right now I have the Rokinon 50mm 1.4 lens on here. I'm going to be making a review on this lens very soon, so make sure to subscribe to this channel to see that review. But with this camera, there's two major problems, which the first one is going to be the autofocus. Now, what a lot of people forget nowadays is that Sony didn't have good autofocus till pretty much the A7 III camera. When the A7 III camera came out, and that camera had like revolutionary, amazing autofocus, and then eventually, I think it was through an update that it got the eye autofocus. It has such amazing autofocus nowadays, We're shooting with the A7 IV, and as you can see, the autofocus is perfection on this camera. But before that, this was made like almost 10 years ago now. This camera camera just has horrible autofocus, and here I'll show you a clip of the camera struggling to autofocus, and even in bright daylight it really struggles. And if you're trying to shoot this camera in any low light situation, then it can barely autofocus. Doesn't matter what kind of lens you have on there, it doesn't matter if it's first party, third party, it just struggles with pretty much all lenses, which is a pretty big deal, because to get a good image quality out of the the sensor, you're gonna need to have your subject in focus. So that's one of the big problems with this camera. Another big problem is something that you might not even think about, but this is actually a really annoying problem for me, is that this camera doesn't have any sensors on the viewfinder. So which that means that when you put your eye on the viewfinder, it doesn't automatically change to it. You actually have to press a button in order to change to the viewfinder. So as you can see right now, it's on the LCD. I don't know if you guys can see it, but when you press it, it switches to the viewfinder. So if you're going back and forth between the viewfinder, you kind of have to have it memorized so that you press the button to go back so you can review your images, and then go back and then press the button so you can take pictures. I'm just not used to doing it because I'm using more modern photography cameras nowadays, but that's one thing that you do have to keep in mind with this camera. And even if you're shooting with a DSLR or something, since you're gonna have an optical viewfinder on the DSLR, you're not gonna be doing the switching back and forth. This is just an old primitive way of doing things, so that's an annoying thing about this camera. Again, that's only when you're trying to get things in focus. Once you do get your picture in focus and you take a picture, you can take some amazing pictures with this camera, especially if you're paired up with the right lens. Now I'm going to show you guys some pictures I have taken with this camera with the Samyang 50mm lens. Again, we're going to be making a review of this lens very soon, so make sure to subscribe. And so let's see some pictures I have taken with this camera. So as you can see, once you get the pictures in focus, you can take some amazing pictures with this camera. But honestly, the autofocusing system on the camera is pretty bad, but there are some really good things about this camera. The first thing being is the ergonomics. Now, when Sony was first making mirrorless cameras, they had a completely different philosophy than other camera manufacturers, which was that, coming from like the old DSLR cameras that were, big, heavy, and bulky, Sony wanted to make their mirrorless cameras smallest and lightest possible, which was a good thing. But the bad thing was that since the cameras were so small, it kind of ruined the ergonomics of this camera. So that's when they made the A3000 camera. Now, the cool thing about this camera is that this camera is designed in their older DSLR cameras, so the grip on this camera actually fits your hand really well, because this is a larger, bigger camera compared to their, I think it was their next 3, 5, and 7 cameras, and then they started making the A5000, and then they started making the A6000 cameras. Those cameras were a lot smaller than this camera right here, and this camera is actually bigger than their original A7 camera that came out around the same time, which was a full frame camera. So even though it's a bigger camera, it's not as capable, but the ergonomics are really nice on this camera. So because of those reasons, one of my favorite ways of using this camera is to actually adapt some vintage lenses on here, like this Helios lens that I showed off before. And when you adapt these lenses on the camera, oh my god, you can take some amazing pictures with this camera. And since you're going to be manual focusing with the camera, and you can turn on focus peaking on this camera, even though it's an older camera, it still has focus peaking on there. So you can manually focus and make sure your pictures are in focus when you do manual focus. And you can take some really cool pictures with it. So let's take a look at those right now. As you can see, the images coming out of this camera are beautiful once you do get them in focus. That's why I'm shooting them with vintage lenses where I manually focus myself is my favorite way of shooting with this camera. But now we're going to take a look at one last thing with this camera, is that this camera can actually shoot in full HD video. Now, the video part of this camera is a little weird. First of all, there's no microphone jack on this camera. If we look at the side, it's just an SD card slot, and then there's a micro USB on the side for charging, so you cannot plug in any microphones onto it. But the camera does have a multimedia hot shoe on there, so I'm guessing you might be able to plug in some microphones on it. I did try the one microphone I do have. I do have this I don't even know what it's called. It's considering it's Sony, it's probably some weird numbering, but I do have one of these multimedia hot shoe microphones, but unfortunately this does not work with it. Here, once I plug it in, it just says the accessory is not sported, so unfortunately this one does not work. So there might be other ones that do work with this camera, but I'm not sure with it, so as far as I know, you cannot plug in any microphones to it. So if you do want professional audio, you do have to just record it externally and then sync it in post. It does have a microphone on top of the camera, as you can see right here. So we're going to be doing the outro of the video on this camera, so we'll be able to see it then. But the one weird thing about this camera is that it does have continuous autofocus on it, which is great. But the thing is that it only works in certain lenses. For some reason, like I don't even know what the rhyme or reason is. Like I tried, first of all, the Rokinon 50mm 1.4 lens, and the autofocus does not work on that lens. So I was like, oh, it doesn't work with third-party lenses. So I tried a first-party, like a Sony 50mm 1.8, and it didn't work on that one either. Then I tried the Tamron lenses, and it works on all the Tamron lenses. Then I tried the Rokinon 24mm 1.8 that's shooting me right now, and it works on that one. And so it just seems random which lens it works with. It even works with the Canon lenses that you adapt onto the camera. The autofocus works on those, so it just picks and chooses which lenses it works with. I guess it depends on what kind of motor it uses or something. I'm not 100% sure, but to test it right now, we're going to go from shooting with the A7 IV to shooting with the A3000 with the same exact lens, which is the Rokinon 24mm 1.8. Alright, so now we're shooting. Okay, I'm guessing this is way too close. I can't really tell because there's no flip out screen on this camera, so we're just shooting blindly. I don't even know if I'm in focus or not, so hopefully the camera is keeping me in focus. And we are using the microphone that is on the camera, so it probably doesn't sound that great. I'm gonna try moving the camera back a little bit, and this is what the image looks like. I had the same exact settings that I did on the Sony A7 IV, so who knows how it looks, but let's try to do like the YouTuber test right here. Let's try to put like a... Here, look at the microphone that you cannot use for some reason. Is it keeping in focus? Who knows? Never know. One thing that sucks about this microphone is that... So this microphone works on the Sony A7R III, but apparently it doesn't work on this camera. It doesn't work on the Sony FS5, and it doesn't work on the Sony A7 IV either. So for some reason this microphone is just very specific to like only certain models of the Sony cameras, which I don't get why. It's just a little microphone, so I don't know. Sony's weird with their accessories for some reason. But anyways, guys, this is what it looks like. Hopefully it looks decent. I don't know. I'll put it like side by side to compare how it will look compared to the A7 IV. I'm sure the A7 IV looks better. They're both in 1080p, but who knows. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching this video. Hopefully it was useful. I make videos every single week, so make sure to subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys in next week's video. Goodbye.